All right, I don't know if that solved all your questions about faith.
Not the most engaging speaker.
Very academic. I felt like I should be taking notes for the test.
I took some notes. You know, it's a kind of riddle, his own presentation, if you don't mind me saying, is riddled with like tensions, right? Like faith he sort of says that if your faith is trying to get God to do something you want, that's idolatry, but you need to be faithful in what you do, so that, parentheses, like, I don't know, you got to fill in what it is that you're going to get out of that, right? So like, that's an interesting thing for me. Well, I don't know what's helpful today, because this we've kind of been building up to this one. I think like there's a lot of substance here.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's helpful to go through the academics, the Bible stories, or if you just already brought questions or thoughts about like what faith means to you, or what's going on with you this week. Susan?
Well, I have to say that for most of my adult life, I knew that I believed in God. But to me, belief and faith are different. And it took me being at a very low point in my life and asking God for help and feeling God's presence, I think, for me to fully engage in faith. I mean, that's just my story.
So I have a follow-up question, and maybe this is for the group, I'm not putting you on the spot. Is faith something that we have, or is it something we accept?
I think we accept.
Well,
I
that's a
think
good
it's something
question.
we
We
have to
grow,
grow from somewhere. We grow into,
yes.
you know, as a child. And you surround it, you culture it. You go to church, you go to Sunday school, so you acquire it.
Hopefully,
Hopefully,
could you be really churchy and not accept faith?
yes.
I think like, and we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, because
I
Herb
think
had this
so.
question, like, sounds like faith is a gift from God, right? Like faith is a gift, and our response might be discipleship. Something like that. Does that sound right, Herb? I think you said something about it, which you distilled from the video, right? Or from one of the readings, right? So I guess I'm thinking about that a little bit. If faith is a gift, is it a possession? I don't know. It's just like a funny thing that we get to linguistically. Is it like a thing you have, or is it a thing that has a hold of you? And what does it take to be gripped by faith, or to like receive it?
I really liked what he said about God reaches out and grasps you, because that's what you're saying.
Well, I'm wondering, and we talked just really briefly about John Calvin, right? Who says like God is transcendent, and God's not going to waste grace on people who don't accept it. So for the elect, there's something called irresistible grace. Like it's such a gift from God, you couldn't even fight it back with a sword. Calvin thought only some people get it, but he did use that phrase, irresistible grace. And he also talked about how fear and doubt can block the gift of faith. But do they block the gift, or do they block our reception of it? So this is like an interesting bit, right?
Yeah.
Like does the gift come to us whether we open it or not? And is that irresistible grace that will be opened for us eventually, whether we choose? Maybe I'm loading this up too much, but these are the kinds of things I'm wondering a little bit in my head.
Well, I think faith was always there for me. I think I had not particularly opened the gift before.
So is faith learned behavior, or is it innate?
Well, I think this is a really good question, and I wonder if this is helpful with like when we think about, is faith different from discipleship?
Yes.
Well, it's interesting, you made a comment that if you have faith, you want to go out in the world and help the sick, the poor, and I'm thinking, well, I know you probably want to do good works, but I never quite thought it would be expressed necessarily that way.
I never equated good works with faith.
Mm.
I've always felt like faith was just something inside you.
Mm.
And it was your acceptance and your acknowledgement that God was in your life.
This is where I think actually the details matter a lot here. It can feel really like parsing, but this seems really important, and I just was curious. I think I asked this at the beginning. Anybody read that book I Am Thou by Martin Buber? Jewish mystic, also a philosopher, and he talks about just fundamental relationships. He's mystic, right? So you got to keep that in mind. And he basically says there's like two kinds of relationships we can have in the world. There's the I-it relationship, where like I'm a subject and something is an object, right? I-it. It's hierarchalized. I get to frame it in some ways, like you fit into my worldview, or you don't, and I can move you around, right? And then he talks about this other one. It works better in German because there's like the you personal and the you formal. There's the do form and the Z form. So the way it sort of works is like that thou, we don't realize this, the thou is the intimate in English. We got rid of it in the 1700s because we didn't like Quakers. But he sort of says there's an I-thou relationship in which the boundaries between two people kind of melt away, and there's like this union between two subjects. And like I've had a few of these moments in my life, right? Particularly like not always expected. Like sometimes I'll have an I-thou moment with somebody I thought I never could, or I met them and it was we had this great I-thou moment, and I thought it's going to be like that again, and I was disappointed over and over again. I don't know if you've ever had this happen, right? Because for some reason there was like magic in the air and there was this great connection, and I wanted it to come back to that, and this magic was gone and it wasn't there, right? And one of the things that Martin Buber says, keep in mind he's mystic, right? Is the moment you think, I am now having an I-thou moment, is the moment it's gone because you just categorized it.
What is a mystic?
A mystic is somebody who kind of like gets so wrapped up in the experience of God that they start to like have insight into like God's
They're weird.
no, I didn't know that they're weird. I mean, like, well, I mean, yeah, I guess they're weird. They're not normal prophets.
They're not
John the Baptist is a mystic. The Apostle Paul's a mystic, right? He talks about how he bears on his body the marks of Jesus. And he doesn't mean like I got beat up. He means like there's some kind of like identification with Jesus that's like this kind of not a fusion of identity, but like, you know, he's had like this I-thou moment with God, and it's like transformed him. When you have a vision, you have that. I mean, I think those are I-thou moments. The only reason I brought all this up is because sometimes I wonder if we say, I have faith, is a statement that puts it into an object relationship, not a subject one. Because it's now something I have. Like it's a commodity. I don't want to bust up the English language too hard. It's interesting to think around that. Is faith something you have, or is it something you have opened yourself to?
Something you
I think you're open
experience, you move into it. To me, a mystic is someone who moves into that wonderful experience and wants to stay there and continues to try to go there.
Yeah.
I think most of us are more cognitive, and faith is more cognitive for us because we've got to exist in the world. I think of mystics having that wonderful, I'm not being critical of them. It's how wonderful that they can live in that all the time and not have to fix coffee for breakfast. Clean up after the coffee.
And so I think, and there is a trend where sometimes we say these people do nothing, and that there is a section of mystics where that's part of the deal. a long time, the fundamental criterion for real mysticism is when you come back, how do you treat other people? And if you come back and you treat other people like you did before, it was not a real experience. This is like in like sort of like criterion within among mystics themselves, right? And so like if you start to receive God's faith in you, then you should start to extend God's faith in you to the other people God has faith in. This is like criterion for real mystical vision. And this brings me to this other question about sacraments, if you don't mind me asking, right? Because a lot of times people say like the sacraments are really important, but you have to have the right, like if you're not in the right place, then the sacrament may not help you, or it may even be disrespectful to take it. I don't know if it doesn't matter if you believe this. I hope you've heard this before.
Yeah.
Like if you're not in the right state, you shouldn't have it. And so this becomes this really good question. Do the sacraments work because of our faith in God or in the sacrament, or do the sacraments work because of God's faith in us?
Does it have to be one or the other?
I don't suppose it does.
Have that both.
And in some ways, I would say, right, if I can accept God's faith in me, that will allow me to embrace the gift that is like cloaked in the sacrament cognitively and otherwise, maybe more so than if I don't. But at the end of the day, the sacraments, which are vehicles of grace, can they hurt you?
Can they hurt you?
Can a sacrament ever hurt you? I grew up that yes, if you took the Lord's Supper, and we weren't sacramental, we were Baptist or Church of Christ, but if you took it in an unworthy manner, you were eating and drinking judgment on yourself. This comes down to 1 Corinthians. And Paul is clearly talking about people who are having a meal, and the people who get there early eat all the food, and then there's no meal for the latecomers, right?
Yeah.
And he's saying that's not a worthy way to have the Lord's Supper. I mean, it's like, imagine coming to a potluck and you eat all the food before the other guests arrive. You can hardly call it I mean, you could say, well, you were unlucky, I suppose. You got the unlucky pot, but right, that would be the opposite of community formation, right? But what we had done with it in the churches that raised me is we'd said, we'd removed it from the context of like an actual shared meal. And we'd said, if you hadn't admitted all your sins before God, or if you hadn't like made up for something, and then you went to take this thing, you would be like disrespecting God. And so then God would return the favor one way or another. So we were, it was like a very sobering thing to take the communion. Sometimes a scary thing, right? And I'm not railing against any tradition, but there's Episcopalians and there's Roman Catholics and there's Lutherans who will say, like, if you haven't had confession, you can't have this, right? Because you're not going to handle it right. I don't want to debate with them, but I do think there's this question about faith, right? Like, how does it work? Do you have to do something for it, or is the doing stuff so that you can unpack what's already there?
As a Catholic who was trained that you have to have no mortal sin before you go to communion. So often we were told we had to go to confession. But then I also later was taught that you could do an inner confession. So it became difficult as a child or as a teenager. Is like, I can't go to communion. I think I have a mortal sin. And then I think, well, what is a mortal sin? Then the definition of that, it's I don't know if anybody else has ever had that struggle or was trained like that in that manner, but it was difficult as a child. And actually, as I talk about it now, it's still difficult. It's still that way. Wow.
And is our concern about approaching grace and not being a good enough, is that an expression of faith, or is that a rejection of faith?
I feel that God has faith in me, that I will have faith in him. Okay? And knowing that God trusts me like that, to have that faith in him, I think allows me to have a deeper faith.
Does is having faith mean that you turn everything over to God and you expect him to do everything without you doing anything? I mean,
That's.
I think some people feel that way, but not everybody, and some religions
because that
be
could,
that, I
yeah,
guess.
that could actually paralyze you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think, you know, in this is a good thing that we talked about last week a little bit, and Meg brought this question up, which I think is a really, really good question to think about. And I really want to frame it like a little bit as a type A kind of somebody prone to like workaholism. Is this, I find this personality type I have very, very rooted in this question, like, hey, like, well, if this is God's gift and it's going to come either way, then what's the point of me doing anything?
It's a good question.
And I think that's like I think that's something we're afraid of because we don't really want to examine who we actually are very deeply. And it does make me think though that if works that I do, works of faith, come out of a fundamental place of anxiety, like I need to earn something from God, God's going to get me if I don't do this right, I think the anxiety goes with them.
Fear.
Like when I give a gift out of anxiety, I think the bow of anxiety is wrapped around that gift, whoever I gave it to. Now, look, it's still nice to give stuff, even if they're wrapped in the anxiety bow. But I think the question is not necessarily what the outcome is. I think where's the center from which things are received and perceived. Have you ever been given a gift and you thought, there's a calculus behind this gift?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Now, they gave you a thing and it was really nice, but
What do
I'm
they
asking
want?
the question if you ever thought like, this is meant to manipulate me.
Every gift my mother ever gave me had strings attached,
Yeah, and so I think you
which
can
is sad.
be a faithful giver, but you can faithfully give anxiety out. And is that the kind of gift you want to give?
No.
Is God anxious about what we'll do with grace?
I don't think he's anxious. We should.
Should, if God's not anxious,
Well,
we should be.
if we should be anxious if we're doing race like we should.
Oh, yeah, and instead of the word should, like, the question is like, if we
Are we
want to
doing
be
it?
like God,
Yeah, are we doing like godly one behavior? No?
oh, I think so, but but I'd like to get rid of the anxiety altogether. I think it's like, okay, like, if I want to be like God, then maybe I need to like do something with my anxiety instead of just sharing it with other people. God can hold my anxiety. I just think the question is God anxious about me? And if not, maybe I don't need to be either. And rather than that making me do nothing, I think that frees me to give authentically. Maybe this is all just, what do you call it? Like, splitting hairs, but I don't think so. I think the really question is like, where do we find our center? I might be being vague.
Seems to me that the whole core of faith and gifting is in relationship, and I don't want to use romantic love, but in loving relationships that build community. So if I'm given a gift from God
that I treasure so much, my reaction is gonna be, I wanna share that. I wanna tell Darlene, hey, guess what I got?
Mhm.
So it seems to me that it's how we handle the gift. The gift is always there.
Well, it seems like if you start to take God's view about giving and the gift of faith, if you say that's how God is, and I am going to accept and enjoy that in my own life, and you start to imagine that God treats all people that way, then how could you not treat other people like God does? Instead of, oh, I'm okay, you're okay, nothing matters, God loves you so deeply that I am choosing to do that as well. I mean, like my dad told me in Vietnam, one of the first things that happened in his experience as a soldier was that the army tried to dehumanize the Vietnamese so that the soldiers could live with themselves after they killed them. Right. And like this was really, really in some ways helpful. And I don't think, let's not delude ourselves, Islam is not the only religion that has used the word infidel to talk about other people's faith life as a means of dehumanizing them.
Yeah.
We did that in the Inquisition in Spain. We did that in the Albigensian and Qatar heresies down in southern France. And I still see it happening actually, like in contemporary churches, where like if you don't have the right belief set, you're a heretic, which means like you're less than, right? And so it seems like faith needs to be the opposite of that, right? Because once somebody's dehumanized, then you can treat them as somebody who's less than human. You can violate their rights, or you can kill them, or you can degrade them. That doesn't seem like faith to me. I guess it's faith in something.
So you're saying dehumanizing is you destroy their esteem, their
They're
self-esteem?
just fundamental dignity, or their worth. They believe
Okay.
the wrong thing. They have the wrong skin color. They don't vote like I do. Whatever criterion we throw out there is like, because you've done this, you're no longer a human being. I'm not sure that's a gift of faith.
No.
Is faith from the Old Testament different from faith in the New Testament when you throw Jesus into the mix?
Well, they don't know the answer to that. I mean, I would say, and given that a lot of us, let's be honest, are like cognitive type folk, we really can't get away that the earliest Christians were all pretty mystic. They had a mystical experience of Jesus
Right.
after he died that was way more powerful to them than any experience they had when he was alive.
Right.
So the whole faith is based on some other people's mystical experience. So that might be different. But, in other ways, you look through the prophets have these, like, frankly, wild visions that are mystical union visions of God, right? And so like that kind of stuff pervades the Bible. You look at what Hebrews says, and we read this, it sort of gives you the checklist of like, by faith, so-and-so did this. And there's this really interesting thing, right? By faith, Sarah and Abraham had this baby Isaac. Well, they didn't have any faith at all. Abraham laughed at God, and so did Sarah. It wasn't their faith. It was God's faith.
Right.
I'm not even sure that's like a New Testament interpretation. I think that's just biblical. Like God's faith in us seems to be the important part. Our response is I suppose, is like what you call discipleship or living it out or embodying it.
Right, I think so.
Which is meant for our enjoyment, I think. But if we see, this is the hard thing, right? If God gives us faith and then punishes us because we didn't use the gift right, and that violates the idea of a gift.
That's a transaction.
Yeah.
I wouldn't take those odds. Would you take a bet on your eternal welfare? That seems like high stakes, friends. That's high stakes. And that happens, you see, that's one of the positive things about the evangelical movement, is it sort of says, once you have this particular kind of faith, you've made it and you're sure and you don't have to doubt it. So you pray the sinner's prayer Now you have to really mean it, and that's where it gets real squishy. If you really mean it, then you're in, and now the community can also accept you because you're like us. But until you do, we're gonna pray for you until you become one of us. And I'm wondering, does God work like that, or do we work like that? And do we have to work like that, or can we work more like God? Is this too nebulous? I'm sorry, I don't know.
No.
Not at all. It's thought-provoking.
One of the interesting things, and look, I'm a Protestant, and most of us in the room are at this point, but we got to read these readers who really tease these out, right? I mean, like, the first one, Cyril, he said, hey, faith and doctrine are not the same thing. Faith and dogma actually have a lot, like very little to do with each other. That's interesting, because I always want to have the right faith. And I hope you heard that. Have as my possession the right doctrine. I'm not sure that's faith. I think that's doctrine. And Cyril calls me out on that. I still like to be right.
But does that necessarily make him right?
I think he's right. I do. I think he's right.
Do you think all of them are?
To different degrees, I do.
Do you?
This one I called out, and Luther says this really interesting thing, right? He says faith is confidence in grace, and that it can't be from works. And this is an interesting thing, because Luther ultimately believed in some predestination. But this is the hard thing that Luther said, right? Is and this was the Reformation, right? Like, hey, it's really good to think about good works, except if like your relationship with God is predicated on works, well, you'll never be good enough. And I don't necessarily like that slant, but I think what I appreciate Luther saying underneath is, if you've got to earn it, if you've got to earn anything from God, who's gonna get those wages? Because if grace is a gift, it can't be earned anyway. And this is what Luther says, right? So you know, if you accept God in faith, then that's plenty, right? That's the thing, whether or not you build a hospital or cure cancer, right? You don't have to like hustle to get God's favor. But you know, to take Luther more seriously than he took himself, do I even have to accept faith? Because that would be a work. If I have to accept faith, that's an act of merit. So if I'm reading Luther really seriously, and it's all about what God gives, my own beliefs are irrelevant to God. My beliefs are so that I can enjoy what God has for me, not so that I can earn what God wants to give me or is already giving. Maybe that's too radical. What's the point? The point is so that I can live out of a center that is not riddled with anxiety, fear, and doubt. And I think when we live that way, naturally deeds of faith come. John Calvin said, right, faith cannot be the same as knowing. And that's interesting, right? That's interesting to think it's not the same as knowledge, so it's not a commodity. In some ways, it's like slippery. It is something that you have to embrace, is what he says. I mean, I don't think, keep in mind, these are like thoughtful, systematic people. So they're not like, oh, throw all the bookmarks down and just accept this thing. That, no, I think what he's saying is, like, mathematically speaking, you can, to prove a rule, you need infinite repetitions. To disprove a rule, you need one counterexample. So if you ask me, do you think your wife loves you? I'd say, well, probably yes. Can I prove it? Well, no, she'd have to prove it every day infinitesimally. And by that strict logic, if she spoke a harsh word to me, well, she didn't love me. So as we grow in love, we start to say, like, hey, because you had a bad day or because you spoke out of turn does not in fact contradict the rule. The rule is proven when we get back together after that. Not that it happened. I don't know if that makes sense. I think that's the kind of thing Calvin's saying is, at a certain point, you're not going to have infinite repetition, so you have to take a leap and say, this is the rule of my life. Even though it would take my whole lifetime to prove it for me, I'm going to accept it now in advance, that God has given me this gift. Merton talks about how faith and reason aren't the same, right? But faith certainly includes reason. And Reinhold Niebuhr talked about this fundamental faith, this idea that life is worth living. Isn't that an interesting one? For him, the basis of faith is the idea that life's worth living. Keep in mind, that's like a post-Holocaust. That's an answer to the Holocaust. Reinhold Niebuhr says that. I don't know. I think thinking through this theologians, there's some really interesting thoughts about that. And I think sometimes we settle into maybe I don't know. I think this is where like it becomes really hard to think about like cultural, and it's always hard to think about accountability. Again, like, so what's the point? If like grace is already there, what's the point? If this is always like the question that I think that comes up for folks. And it's because we're very outcome focused and we're very outcome driven, and we want to point to things in like maybe faith is pointless, actually. Like maybe it doesn't have a point. Maybe it's something God's like just delighted to share. Like a gift for no reason. You're given a gift for no reason. Those are some of my favorite ones. Like, there was not a holiday. There was nothing you did special for me. I saw this thing, I thought of you, and for no reason, I was really happy to give it to you. I could say, well, the reason is you were thoughtful. The reason is you were caring, but no, that's not the reason. All that proceeded from that relationship. I don't know. I'll be quiet now. Sorry, I think I'm over talking on this one.
You know, you asked a question about good works. And do you do good works because you have faith? Or can you do good works without having faith? Just because you should.
Can I reframe the question? Do good works come from God's faith in you, or do good works come from your faith in God?
That's a good question. About both.
Yeah.
I don't know that it has to be either or, but if somebody sees somebody in need and has compassion and helps them, and they don't believe in God, was that an act of faith?
Yes.
I think so too.
Mm-hmm.
I think so too.
Yeah. It's faith in
Humanity.
yes.
Faith in humanity.
Well, there was something last week where I wrote it down. Christ the Lord supports me being authentic. And you're a non-believer who does that good work. It's authentic.
So you don't believe non-Christians can do good works?
No, I do believe non-Christians.
That's what she's saying, is that it comes from God's faith in us. Even if we don't have faith in God per se, like a doctrine or a dogma or a worldview, that when you see somebody and have empathy and compassion, that's God's faith in us.
And God's pleased because you're being authentic.
That's pretty progressive, Kay. I don't know. It sounds liberal to me.
I have that side, don't tell somebody.
Well, it seems pretty hopeful, right? Because otherwise, what happens to people who were born in Aboriginal Australia? Well, they don't know the right information. Does God have any less faith in them? I hope not.
Well, they're all God's
Well, they
people.
don't even know about God. Some of them.
Is this the case that people don't know about God? This is a really great question.
Yeah.
My mother-in-law told me that I was not a Christian because I believed that the Aborigines would be saved by God, even though they had not been exposed to him or know anything about him.
I think your
And
mother-in-law
she
was
said,
wrong.
she said that you're not a Christian. I was like, Evelyn, what? You know?
It's a really great question when we talk about, and we do this in church language still, but regardless, but
Mhm.
particularly in more fundamentalist denominations, we say so-and-so doesn't know God.
Yeah.
Again, is it important that we know God or that God knows us? And if God is embodied in the world and in time itself, who does not know God?
Well, they live under a rock.
So as
I
long as
mean,
we're
there's
willing
no
to,
Society and information, and I think we're pretty past that in our world, maybe not.
I just, what I worry sometimes is we see somebody with a different doctrine than ours, and we say, because your doctrine's wrong, you don't know God. And that's a step toward the I-it relationship and not toward the I-thou. There's a way that we can keep our convictions without saying everybody else has to do it this way.
You have to respect other people's right to their beliefs. Whether they believe the same way as we do, or you dehumanize it.
Well, I think that's it. And so the question is, are we willing to, in faith, dehumanize somebody else?
No,
I know I'm asking this pretty abrasively. I didn't plan to.
that's okay.
This is all just what's turning in my head about how all of this is supposed to go. Can I tell you a bad story?
Yes.
I called my mentoring rector a couple years ago, and I shared snippets of this. And I told him, and look, I'm just going to go ahead and be very like straightforward with you. At the time, there were a couple people who were like sending me, every email they sent was complaining about something. And I said, you know, Edward, I'm just wondering if this has been your experience, that like the people who complain the most and who have the most demands on my time, like I need to meet with you. I need to meet with you is really, really nice. I'm glad you had that need. I need to meet with you every week because of something you said in your sermon, or because of the paint color that was chosen for the building, like this sort of thing. I said, Edward, I have found like there's a couple of people who do this a lot to me, and they don't give anything to the church. They don't give any time, don't give any service, don't give any money, but they make lots of demands, frankly, on my time and complaints. And I said, I've been really surprised, Edward, that like there's people like our biggest donors here, when they make a donation, they will tell me literally, here's what I think the money's for, but this God's money at this point. So whatever you think needs to go to is great. Or they'll say, I gave this money, but I gave it and it's now up to you guys. I didn't think it would be like that. When somebody says that behind $100,000, it's startling to me because people will designate a $20 check, right? And I said, have you had this experience? Because those people who are the big donors have the fewest demands of my time. And in fact, when they're sick and I say, hey, you know, can I come visit you? They're like, I don't need a visit. And I think they mean that authentically. So I asked him about this and he said, well, I've never thought about it exactly like you presented it, but I think it's because people who are generous are healthier people. Like they're physically healthier, they're spiritually healthier, so they don't need your stuff.
Wow.
And people who are stingy are not healthy people, and so they need help from you.
Was that what you
And
wanted to
Did
do?
that help?
I think he's right.
Did it help?
Well, and I think it speaks to a little bit like what do expressions of faith really look like? I don't think they're like flamboyant liquidations of stuff, but I do think about like, hey, when I find myself doing a lot of complaining, is that a faithful response? The reason I ask this is, does God sit around and complain about us?
Gabriel, let me tell you what happened at St. Thomas.
Oh, Holy Spirit. Look at Ellen. Oh, Jesus. Well, look at Valerie. I know this sounds funny, but I think it's really important because if that's not how God expresses faith, then if we express that faith way, that our faith that way, maybe we're missing out. I don't mean like we should never complain about stuff. I don't mean that. And I don't mean that there's like constructive solutions to our problems. But I guess what I'm asking is, does God need to vent?
I don't think he needs anything.
Well, so I think since I share that viewpoint, Tim, like this is part of what our conversion is. Like, how do I find my center in God's center? Instead of how do I like pack God language into the center I already have?
I keep hearing you say God. Little bit like, but in here, they talk about the narrowness of the Christian faith. That probably bothers you, doesn't it?
Well, I get that it's a viewpoint.
And, we are compelled to have faith in Jesus as he's revealed to us, which is kind of exclusion scenario a little bit. And so he asked the question at the end here, consider the narrowness implied when we say salvation is by faith in Christ, not in God. Okay, just differentiate. How such narrowness justified? And how would you explain it to someone who holds a different view? Did anybody answer that question?
I can only answer it on a personal basis.
Yeah.
This is not theology per se, but it's what brings me here. I place value in all religions, and I feel that it's all the same God. I feel that they have different paths from different cultures and different histories, and that those paths are valid in reaching their concept of God. My concept may be different, but it's still the same God. I choose the Christian path because I was brought up in that, and my brain is in sync with the language and the manifestations of our faith. I choose to walk this path, even though I believe the others also have value. That's how I reckon. I mean, I feel like I'm Christian, but it may not be the narrow definition of Christian.
Mhm.
And I'm sure people would say I'm a heretic,
No,
but I do believe in Christ.
I've heard Tim say the same, something similar to that. Maybe I have too. I just know, my faith has been revealed to me through Jesus Christ. So
Yes.
that's what I know. He can reveal himself or manifest himself to others in other ways, but it does. If you don't have that larger view, you can really have a narrow view of God's love, for you, God's faith in us.
I think that's one of the concerns, I think, with like really strict denominationalism at a certain point. Like, I tell you, when my brain's really working, the Missouri-centered Lutheran Church is not a way of life I want to walk. But I don't know that it's like wrong with a capital W. And
It's
I
wrong
think,
for you.
yeah, I don't think I could walk that path faithfully and be like who I perceive God imagines me to be. But well, like,
The Missouri.
oh,
I knew that
like a
split.
Gloria Day, yeah, a Gloria Day. Like, well, Missouri Synod in general, like women can teach but can't preach. Same-sex relationships are not like from God, and that's not going to work out well. And Jesus died. His death was a penal substitutionary atonement, so he died to take my place because God is angry and wrathful, and somebody has to get the punishment. So I don't want to say, like earlier, since I was raised in many of those tenets, I had to say those are wrong. And now I'm getting to the point where it's like not the life I want to live. Although I see that there's value, some value in that community or other people, it's not what I need. at this point in my life.
Mhm.
And I think this is where denominationalism gets really, really sticky, especially with that phrase, right? So it's all through Jesus, but which one?
Yeah.
The one presented by the Missouri Synod Church or the Wisconsin Synod Church or the ELCA, just to talk about Lutheranism. Because to be honest, all three of them have very different understandings of Jesus. Which one's right? So do you have, this is the question that I think denominationalism makes us ask. Do I have to be right for God to be righteous?
So. The interesting question is going to be. Why not you were born here in the United States. And if you had been born in, say, Iran or Iraq or a place like that.
Yep.
I mean, is all this just a kind of luck? I mean.
It's only luck if we consider we're right and they're wrong.
Well, Cardinal Ratzinger seemed to embrace the thought that other religions have value too, and that's okay.
So this becomes a really tough question, I think, is rolled up in faith. I think a lot of us at the table can say other religions have value, some value, lesser value, leads us right off that slope.
Yeah.
Instead of, look, my faith chose me in the sense that my mother was a faithful Christian who raised me in church, and similar to what Darlene said, this is my narrative. In some ways, it chose me before I even chose it, but I'm so saturated in it. I think it's really fascinating what people do religiously, like I do, and I always come out in these arguments. Am I respecting a different religion or am I appropriating it? And this is like a tough thing to call, right? It's tough to call, but because I have like curiosity, like genuine curiosity, you know, again, I see that I'm drawn, but to be honest, even in the middle of my good curiosity, like this is my core script. This is it, because I'm like deeply saturated in it. So like I can jokingly say that like sometimes I really have some Jewish envy, but my core script is set. I can tinker with it some, which is like what I'm trying to do, so that I can find a center that I think is more like the God I believe in than the center I've been living into. And denominationalism is hard because I've thought really hard, I've studied really hard, I've read really hard, and I've had damage in these other things. So I'm trying not to say, hey, that's wrong. Instead, like, that's just not going to be the way I choose to walk. And this bit about Jesus that I think becomes really important with that last question, because we can answer a lot of ways. You know, Karl Barth basically says predestination's real. God believes in predestination, and here's God's predestination. God predestined salvation of all through Christ. So you don't have to know Jesus. God already took care of it. That's an interesting thing. Predestination is not about the community, it's about the mechanism. So God predestined salvation of the world through Jesus, which means it's going to happen, whether you want it or not. You don't have to know Jesus that still have worked for you. That's just an interesting way to read. And that was like in the 1940s. So I guess you could say that's like liberal, but it's like old liberalism. Susan, thanks for being patient.
I have a very dear friend who belongs to a very conservative church and has a very conservative view of the world. And I was expressing to her that at one point in time, I was going through a difficult period and I felt very down and very upset and worried and concerned and whatever. And she says, well, who did you turn to? And I said, my friends. I turned to my friends to talk to them about it, and they lifted me up. And she said, that wasn't the answer I wanted. She wanted me to say,
Church of God.
Christ is my savior,
Yeah.
because it appears that that's her answer to everything. Okay,
Yeah,
And
And
there are
having a
people that believe that.
and having a conversation with her that involves religion has become a little difficult for me, and I believe Christ is my savior.
Yeah.
But it isn't the first thing I'm gonna say.
yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. I mean, I can tell you, like, when people come to my door and like want to evangelize to me,
Oh, yeah. I would like to be a little on the door
No, you
listening.
I'm not always most super patient, but in general, because I have this perception that really they want me to give the answer that they want.
Yes.
But I don't think God created me to satisfy their desires. I don't think that's how it works. And so, like, that's kind of an a priori conflict. I am not going to give you what you want. And I'm, in some ways, like, I can say, hey, thanks for taking your faith seriously, we're all good. That's a really clear invitation to leave. Of course, usually they don't do that. Usually they keep on. And then I start to get increasingly agitated because I didn't ask you to come here and you're on my private property, which we say we both believe in, private property, and you're not invited. And I'd like to think that there's times where we might say, God, butt out, you're not invited onto my private property. I don't know that that hurts God's feelings. I'm not sure God butts out either, but we're probably living inside of God's private property. It's probably the better model, right?
This brings up a question for me I had, on page 160 in that second paragraph. He's talking about Adam and Eve disobeying.
Yeah.
It says, why did they obey? Quite simply, because they did not believe. I'm sorry, I can't go there.
Mhm.
I mean, there's been lots of times that I've disobeyed and I still believe.
I think it's
I think there will be times in the future that I do that.
it's in some ways a really confusing story that we try to like over wrangle meaning out of, but just a face reading. Why did they disobey? Because they wanted to be like God. Isn't that the whole point of discipleship, is to be like God? Knowing stuff and having life, these are goals of our like society. Know stuff, live long. Those are like admirable goals. Oh no, they should have just accepted they should just be ignorant. We don't accept that as a way of life. Look at us, we're having a study now because we want to know more.
That's right.
Yeah.
God gave us good brains to use, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's-
This is where I think sometimes we flatten faith into a commodity, or we flatten faith into believing cognitively in 7 principles. And you need to check those boxes and then you have the right faith. And I know that it gets really messy when I'm saying I'm not sure if that's it, because then you start to say, well, how far does grace go? Does grace go to people who refuse it? I hope so, but that's hard for us to hold on to. Because like, I don't always feel like treating my kids that way. Like, sometimes I'm like, fine, do it yourself. I'm ready to give up, right? Or, hey, like, we're gonna have a come to Jesus meeting, and that's such an interesting phrase, isn't it? Because that means you're gonna leave having agreed to do what I say, right? But I didn't see Jesus treat people that way, actually.
No.
The story of Cain and Abel is kind of interesting. I don't quite understand why the sacrifice of Cain was not acceptable.
Nobody understands, and so what we do is we make up lots of reasons because our brains don't handle ambiguity well.
Yeah.
So what I heard is God demands a life, and that's why, or that Cain gave produce of secondary quality. The story doesn't say any of that.
Right.
And I think if you want me to be fair, when I tell this story, I guess this is not reading the story at face value, but I guess the question is, did God prefer one offering or one over the other, or did Cain think God preferred one offering over the other? I know I'm messing with the text a little bit, but as God did not give instructions that we know of, is it possible that Cain said, well, God likes Abel better. I've had a brother, I had thoughts like that all the time, right? And then what do you do when you're jealous? Even, you ever been jealous over something that was not worth being jealous about? Mom loves you more. Turns out my mom didn't prefer either one of us. I just thought she preferred me, but she didn't prefer either of us. So, you know, but sometimes you have this thought, and look, that plays out in Genesis. Dad loves Joseph, and the brothers have this thought. Well, if Joseph weren't around, then Dad would love us. And that's always wrong.
Yeah.
But that's what they think. And Cain maybe has that thought too. Hey, if I get rid of the competition, then I get all of God's favor. That's very human thinking. In that sense, I find myself in that story. The other take, or Cain gave a lesser gift and he was slothful, that story doesn't speak to me at all. It doesn't. It really puts in like, oh, I better give God the very best thing. Like, it heightens my anxiety instead of saying, that anxiety you've got, like, God favors people because they gave a thing you didn't give. Look what God says. Hey, you got temptation at your door, you need to shepherd it. Like, you need to put it into pasture. In being worried that God prefers one person over me, that's a worry I need to shepherd, not internalize. I need to shepherd it. That's how I find the story useful.
Well, if God created all of us equal, then he doesn't prefer one over the other, I think.
Or prefers us equally.
Yeah, he prefers us all equal, yeah.
But I think we meddle with that because we said, well, somebody has more abilities than we do, so God must love them more. Or so-and-so has more money, or they never get a speeding ticket, even if they go 100 miles an hour. Because we start to say, like, circumstantially, that doesn't seem to play out. And since God, of course, is pulling strings up in the heavens, God's pulling the good strings for the good folk. And when you start to, like, cut the strings, but it's a little unsettling because, like, again, like, my parents loved me the best they knew how, and they're good parents, but I did have a lot of anxiety about, was I going to lose their love? Was I going to lose their love?
That's not uncommon with kids.
I don't think it's in common with human beings for the reason that, again, it takes one counterexample to disprove a rule, and we get one of those from every person we know every day. You didn't call me enough. You must not care. I said hello and you didn't smile. You must be mad at me. This is just what we do. We project and we transfer. And I think it describes us, but I'm not sure that description is the way I should understand faith.
Or God.
Or God. In fact, I wonder if that description isn't something I'm called to shepherd. Because it's crouching at my door and knocking, but I'm called to shepherd it, not adopt it.
Well, all these were interesting stories given. Nebuchadnezzar and his three, don't ask me to jump into the verse.
And say, God can save me, but even if not.
Yeah, no.
You know, I don't know that they're the best stories for faith.
They're funny stories that way. And even, there's this story that Paul tells in Romans. Abraham believed God and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. This is a phrase that Paul uses to talk about faith alone. But this is where I want to out Luther. If I am reckoned righteous because of my belief, that's an act of merit or a work. There's a different way rabbis read this. Rabbis say the alternate reading is that Abraham believed God and reckoned God righteous for having promised him an heir. Because the subject is ambiguous. Does God reckon Abraham righteous because he believes? Or does Abraham reckon God righteous because God promises? I hope you hear the difference. No, they're not
Yeah.
necessarily mutually exclusive. But I reckon God righteous when I think we all make it in the end. That seems righteous to me. I don't think God reckons me righteous because I think that. I think I reckon God righteous because I trust that. So what does faith demand from us? Well, probably nothing. But I think when we receive faith, how can we not be changed?
How can you not do the good works? How can you not recognize the marginalized people? How can you not?
Yeah. I should tell you too that, and I probably mentioned this till about 5 or 6 years ago, if I'd been in financial trouble, I'd have gone to my fundamentalist friends because they might have shamed me or guilted me, but they'd have given me the money because their faith compelled them to do stuff. And look, I'm going to tell you, fundamentalists, they are much more generous than Episcopalians.
Yes.
By and large, particularly with their churches, because 10% is a minimum. And the Episcopal Church is like 2.5%, and I'm not complaining about it, but I just want to say, sometimes I look at folks and I say, well, you're giving for the wrong reason, but they're still giving.
Yeah.
Right? They are. And this is like an important value for me is like, hey, your way of life may not be the one I want to walk, but I do admire your discipline and your generosity. So much so that even though you think I'm a heretic, like you would watch my daughter while I went to a meeting for me because your faith tells you should. So I have a lot of admiration for that. Now, about 5 years ago, I realized, no, I've got good progressive liberal friends who would also take care of me. But it took me a while to figure that out because I'm just going to tell you again, like fundamentalist people are very disciplined with what they do. And it's a boon. I just wish we could take the anxiety out of it, but maybe they would give less if they were less anxious. I don't know the answer to that. I don't think it's necessarily one-to-one. In fact, maybe the fact that I had doubt about that is like an area for rebirth in my own life. I don't know if you've had a similar experience or not. I hope not, by the way. But I do think there starts to become a point in a moment of disagreement where I can say, your way is not the one I choose to walk, and I can affirm what I see it positively doing for you. I may not like your motives, but I see you doing these works that I believe are good works. And creating that affirmational space, I wonder if that isn't kind of the faith God has in us. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
This showed up yesterday in a Bible study, and I don't want to bore you with it, but I think a lot of times the Jesus I grew up imagining, like his parents never got frustrated with him, he didn't have a harsh word or anything. Like it'd be like a piece of Melba toast walking around. So I'm trying to re-envision the story a little bit like, God, maybe his parents, instead of praying to him, like, oh, son, we need this thing, we're probably like, you're driving me crazy. And why am I afraid for Jesus to have driven his parents to the brink? Because I did that. My kids do that to me. Like maybe him having a personality that rubbed people the wrong way is just what it means to be human.
We don't think of him having a personality at all. It's kind of like an idol or something.
I think so. I think we look at him as this understanding of perfection as flawless instead of perfection as constantly being open to God's faith in him and to God's grace without his merit. I mean, that's the message of baptism you'll hear on Sunday, right? Jesus shows up, he gets dunked, he has this vision, you're my son, the beloved, with you I'm well pleased, and he hasn't done anything yet. He didn't work a miracle, he didn't teach in the synagogue. his ministry begins with the fact he doesn't have to earn God's pleasure. He already has it. Instead of I'm doing a ministry to curry favor with God.
Have you seen any episodes of The Chosen? It's interesting. I just watched the first season of it, and it shows Christ as a very human individual. As a young boy, when he went to speak in the temple, and how frustrated his parents were with him,
Yeah.
because he just took off, like any one of our kids. It was in a crowd, and
At Disneyland.
and
Yep.
he just took off, and they're frantic looking for him, and like, don't you ever do that again, so it's kind of interesting in that it makes him very human.
Well, and sometimes we think personality, again, I think personality is really, really important to think about, because it's like one of the gifts of being human, although sometimes my personality annoys me. But it isn't wrong. It's being embodied. So, like, what if Jesus had really bad breath? Oh, he was perfect. He couldn't have had bad breath. Like sometimes I think we talk ourselves out of like the way grace shows up, embodied ways. Like, did Jesus get ingrown hairs? I'm sure I get them. So surely he got them. Well, no, because he was perfect. Was Jesus a pretty looking guy?
Who knows?
No one ever said.
No, or as the whole story based on the Da Vinci Code, that he had a baby. No,
Yeah, it's just really interesting to think about, and I hope you hear. I don't have an answer, because there's no answer about this, right? But like, what fences do we put around faith? Like, that's right faith, that's wrong faith. Faith requires this of me. I have it. I think that's was the goal of just thinking through all this, because I think. Even though it's hurtful sometimes, and like I have like the vulnerability hangover, I kind of think God would rather I have fewer fences in my life than more.
Well, because you asked an interesting question, you kind of looked at faith as something you can possess or something you can be open to. If you possess it, then you think your faith wouldn't meander. When you're open, it's allowed to do that a little. You're allowed to have doubt, like the guy talked about a little bit.
Yeah.
And you just continue to pray for faith.
And I would say, and I'm not like super romantic, but like when he asked about like, did you love your spouse quickly or over over time? I'd say yes, but I did have like, it's gonna sound really strange, but like particularly young me had this gift of love that happened very fast for me, that I have since grown into. I don't know if that's been your experience, but like I talked myself out of, I did it, God did it, I don't know, all of my objections to pursue a relationship with this other person who was not interested in me. And if I'd had to develop it over time only, it wouldn't have worked. Like there was some kind of jump start that came from outside of myself. It felt like that got that going. And I'd call that a gift of love, right? Maybe it came from somewhere down in here I don't know about, whatever, but I think I was open to it.
Yeah.
And I'm also pretty convinced that if I met Rebecca for the first time today, I don't know if we'd be interested in each other. And that doesn't make me sad, like that, I'd be all right, actually. Like I could have married somebody else and been differently happy. And I don't regret the relationship I've got. I'm grateful for it. And I'm able to hold both of those in faith, if that makes sense.
It does.
I hope this is helpful or at least interesting. I'm really grateful to do it with you because, at least it's helpful for me. So thanks for being conversation partners. Next week we'll talk about the Holy Spirit.
Oh, that'll be good.
Maybe.